Welcome to Chapter 2 of the Book of Diagenesis. Chapter 1 of the Book of Diagenesis was our crash course in mudstone sedimentology and taught us that diagenesis is the word that describes the group of processes that change sediments into sedimentary rocks. Chapter 1 covered up through the diagenetical processes that mud undergoes while changing from soft, wet mud into solid mudstone rock. We do know Chapter 1 ran very long. We'll do better this time. You, our viewers, should watch Chapter 1 first so that we will all be singing from the same sheet of music when we dive into Chapter 2. That's just a suggestion. We'll start out today where Chapter 1 left off with a review of the sediment accumulation rates that we've seen in our research. From there, we'll take a deep dive into how young Earth creationists think the sedimentology world works. They propose a model and hypothesis where most of the world's sedimentary rocks were deposited during the 1 year of Noah's flood. This creates for them a massive mud problem, and we will explore the many ways in which their flood model fails. Our apologies in advance, the dogs have taken to mudslinging in Chapter 2. It was unavoidable. You do know dogs can be cranky at times. We will close out this video with a number of questions to the young Earth community. Our answers to our questions clearly demonstrate that the young Earth fundamentalist flood model of sediment deposition is physically and mathematically impossible. Bible geologists will not be able to answer our questions, and we expect they will ignore our questions out of fear of having to admit the truth that they are wrong on all counts. As with all things related to Mother Earth, this is an inspiring story that we think you'll enjoy. Please proceed with Diagenesis Chapter 2, Number 1.
Believe it or not, there's a vibrant and growing body of research on the rates at which mud settles to the ocean floor. The following is just a short list of the literature to provide us with some kind of typical mud accumulation rates. Citations are shown on the slides. We have two measurements to learn about today: sediment accumulation rate and mass accumulation rate. Sediment accumulation rate, which we can acronymize to SAR, is the sediment thickness that accumulates each year. That will be in millimeters or centimeters per year. And mass accumulation rate, which we can acronymize to MAR, is the sediment thickness that accumulates each year over some area of sea floor and is reported as either kilograms per square meter per year or grams per square centimeter per year. You can toggle back and forth between them, we think, by knowing the density of the mud. Mass accumulation rate equals sediment accumulation rate times the sediment's density. From our quick review of the literature, it seems like a typical mass accumulation rate is 0.3 to 0.5 grams per square centimeter per year far from sources of mud, and an order of magnitude higher closer towards source areas. That's not very much mud. And 0.2 to 0.5 centimeters per year for the sediment accumulation rate. That's also not very much mud. Higher rates closer to sources of sediment, of course. We also found some recent work from the European Union that shows much higher rates close to river mouths, as you would expect. The highest we found, again, we just skimmed the literature, was 48 millimeters, about 5 centimeters or 2 inches, per year in the Seine river mouth. Out on the open seas and in other areas without lots of human-induced erosion, the rates were always much less than about 10 millimeters per year. You can see from this figure how the Yangtze River transports a lot of mud to the East China Sea. Some is deposited at the river's mouth, and some is transported down current between Taiwan and mainland China. Here we see the ocean circulation patterns around Taiwan as determined by researchers from Communist China. You can see very clearly the direction the mud from the Yangtze River is traveling, down into and through the Taiwan Strait. Now, we're not saying that the research is being done in preparation for China's invasion of Taiwan. We're not saying that at all. That is data China would need for seaborne landing. But we are not spreading invasion rumors. Today, mud is also deposited in lakes.
This is editing geo-cutting in. We found these nice blocks of silt down the road apiece. It's silt, but probably has a trace of clay-sized grains mixed in. It's part of an old glacial lake bed, so all of the silt and clay-sized grains are going to be ground up quartz and feldspar and probably has no clay minerals in it at all. We'd probably see some microscale features like ripple marks, and the laminae would be crystal clear if we had more than just our eyes and a hand lens. Mix this with water and we'd get mud. This could have been a mudstone of the future, but we rescued it in time. And it is fragile. It breaks into nice flattish plates. You can see some mud cracks there, those little hair-thin lines cutting across the mud. Mud cracks form as the mud dries out in the open. So these mud layers were deposited shallow enough to dry out periodically. Probably we'd see some soft sediment deformation features if it doesn't fall apart first. You can now see those rusty laminae right there in front, and some nice little microstructures on another piece. Let me lift the lid here for you. Let's see what we can see underneath. Not sure what those microstructures are there, though. Not such a bad way to view some mudstone in training, is it? You can see the silt breaks into a fine powder there on the bottom of the pan. This will blow around for miles in the good breeze. That was what we call dead air time. I ran out of things to say about that beautiful slab of lakebed silt. Number one, take over if you please. Number one, number one, number one.
So sediment accumulation rates of a few millimeters per year look to be typical and normal in areas far from sources, while rates can be something like 5 centimeters, 2 inches, per year where erosion is rampant. Remember that 5 centimeters, 2 inches, we will dub that the SAR of the saying. That number will be a prominent player through the rest of this video.
We had begun this video on our own last year, but this is our hobby and it takes a lot of time. Auntie Gutsick Gibbon beat us to the punch and introduced the young Earth creationists' mud problem to the YouTube universe. She does a great job on this and all her topics. If you haven't subscribed to Gutsick Gibbon, you should fix that right now. Calling card for her channel is up top somewhere. Conventional geology allows the rocks and their precursor sediments to be deposited and lithified over whatever time span it took. We let the rocks tell us how long it took. Young Earth creationists do the opposite. They tell the rocks how long they have to form. That's not a difference in worldview as young Earthers would have you believe. The young Earth view is just backwards. Young Earth creationists have proposed an hypothesis that all the sediments that formed almost all the sedimentary rocks in the world were deposited during Noah's one flood year were exposed to all the diagenetic processes in that one flood year and emerged as solid sedimentary rock during that one flood year. That's a rough consensus of their position as best we can tell. Some young Earthers say the most recent sedimentary rocks were deposited after Noah's flood. Some young Earth types allowed diagenetic processes to be stretched out over the past few thousand years instead of just during the one flood year. Even their own camp cannot agree on the most basic basics. The young Earth community and their Bible geologists call this their young Earth flood model. Let's dive right in and see what we can make out of this muddy mess. We'll state the problem. Young Earth fundamentalists insist that their Bibles have to be correct no matter what. Therefore, fundamentalists need almost all of the world's muds to be deposited and lithified during the one flood year. We think that's a real tall geologic order. Their reliance on their literal interpretation of an inerrant scripture leaves them in a very awkward, difficult, complicated position. They tie themselves up in knots. This is the young Earth creationista's mud problem. Let's illustrate the difficulties that the young Earth creationists make for themselves with a couple of examples. Look back at that table of mudstone formations from around the globe that we saw in Chapter 1 of the Book of Diagenesis. For our first example, we'll go to the Hermit Shale in the Grand Canyon. A common young Earth creationist mistake is conflating the time needed for depositing mud with the time needed for diagenesis to occur. Those are two separate processes. They are related, sure, but we learned in Chapter 1 of the Book of Diagenesis that lithification of a sequence of mud cannot really begin until all the pore water has been expelled from that mud. And young Earthers do not dispute that. The Hermit Shale is 100 feet 30 meters to 900 feet 275 meters thick in the Grand Canyon. Young Earth creationists frequently ask why conventional geologists object to the Hermit Shale being deposited in 1 year during Noah's flood. Sit back and we will show you how we know their claim is wrong. We'll walk through this step by step. The simplest calculation that fundamentalists usually perform is to compute the time for the Hermit Shale to form by dividing the existing shale thicknesses by the 365 days of the flood year to get what they need. Doing so, we see that they would need 3 to 30 inches, 1 to 12 centimeters, of mud deposited each day for the whole of Noah's one flood year to accumulate the 100 to 900 feet 30 to 275 meters of Hermit Shale. That is one gigantic load of mud. But hold on. Gets worse for the young Earth creationistas. That's actually not the correct way to calculate the time. The Hermit Formation in Grand Canyon is 100 to 900 feet 30 to 275 meters thick. But the shale formed from some much thicker sequence of mud and was then lithified into what we see today. They should be using the thickness of the Hermit mud that would later be lithified into the Hermit shale in their calcs. We will do the math correctly, we hope. The starting thickness of Hermit mud had to have been much thicker than the thicknesses we see exposed in the Grand Canyon's walls. To run our numbers, we need to make a couple of assumptions because we were not there with our measuring instruments during deposition. To make the math easier, we'll assume the mud at the beginning of diagenesis had a porosity of 50%. That means to form the Hermit's future lithified 100 feet 30 meters to 900 feet 275 meters in 1 year, we'll need the Hermit's original mud to be twice that, or 200 feet 60 meters thick on the thin end and 1800 feet thick 550 meters on the thick end. All of this mud has to be deposited in one flood year, so the young Earther sediment accumulation rate is something like 200 to 1800 feet per year, or using the correct units of measure 6,000 to 55,000 centimeters per year. That is one gigantic load of mud. Remember our maximum sedimentation rate, we called it SAR of the Seine. It was 48 millimeters per year. We'll round that up to 50 millimeters per year and call it 5 centimeters, 2 inches per year. That's per year. So compare conventional geology's 2 inches per year to the young Earth creationists' 2,400 to 21,600 inches per year. The sedimentation rates that the young Earth fantasy crowd needs to prove their point are 1,200 to 11,000 times that fastest sediment accumulation rate we've seen. Holy moly coly! But there's more wrong there. Our initial stabs used a full 365-day year for the Hermit mud to be deposited. In their actual model, young Earthers need all of the Grand Canyon sediments to be deposited in that 1 year. The few hundred feet of Hermit mud is only 10%-ish of the full thickness of Grand Canyon sedimentary rock formations. A consensus seems to be having all 5,000 feet, 1,500 meters, of Grand Canyon sedimentary rocks deposited during the first 150 days of Noah's flood. The Hermit is in the top half of that stratigraphic sequence. Keep things simple and rolling here, we'll assume the Hermit mud was deposited in 10% of that 150 days or 15 days. Let's see what that, revelation does to the young Earth sediment accumulation rates, shall we? Depositing 200 feet of mud in 15 days equals 13 plus feet per day. That's 160 inches at the thin end of the Hermit, and 1,440 inches per day at the thick end. That's 13 to 120 feet each day for 2 weeks, and just for the Hermit mud. Those are some truly impressive sediment accumulation rates. Converting over to metric will allow us to compare these sedimentation rates to our published literature review more easily. 148,000 centimeters per year at the thin end and over 1.3 million centimeters per year at the thick end. 400-ish centimeters per day versus 5 centimeters per year at the thin end and 3,600 centimeters per day versus 5 centimeters per year at the thick end. Wow! Those sediment accumulation rates are physically impossible. We don't actually need to go any further. But we will. We know that there are no Earth processes capable of transporting and depositing mud at these required flood year sediment accumulation rates. Young Earth creationistas will say, sure there are. Have you never heard of volcanoes and their ash? Or mud flows? And yes, we have. That's how we know those sedimentation rates are impossible. The Hermit is not volcanic ash, it's clearly formed from alluvial mud. And the Hermit's not a mud flow, we can see that in the texture and stratification of the rock. So no. Young Earth fundamentalist. There is no known process that could supply mud in anywhere close to the sediment accumulation rates you need for your fantasy world to be true. Will back calculating using our real sedimentation rates tell us anything? Maybe we'll get a reality check. Let us see. Dogs do not fear math like young Earth creationists do. Assuming that the Hermit's precursor mud was twice as thick with a porosity of 50%, our starting point would be 200 feet, 60 meters of mud. The maximum mud deposition rate that we could find away from river mouths was a really muddy 4 or 5 millimeters per year, 1/6 inch per year. Let's up that to 6 millimeters to make for an even 1/4 inch per year. Using the 6 millimeters per year rate, our calculations show 60 meters divided by 6 millimeters per year equals just shy of 10,000 years to be deposited. Using that same deposition rate, the thicker end of the Hermit, 1,800 feet, 550 meters, would require 86,538 years to be deposited. So the time needed to deposit just the thinner part of the Hermit Shale is far, far longer than young Earth fundamentalists think planet Earth has even existed. Let's doodle a bit more. Quadruple that sedimentation rate and see what we get. The thin end of the Hermit would be 200 feet divided by 1 inch per year equals 2,500 years to be deposited, and 22,500 years were thickest. That 1 inch, 25 millimeters, per year seems like a fast but not unreasonable rate. But even that fast a rate would not be anywhere near enough to satisfy the young Earth cultist, would it? From a young Earth viewpoint, a sediment accumulation rate of 200 to 1,800 feet, 60 to 550 meters, of mud in 15 days or so is a miraculous, disastrous rate of sedimentation. That's over 13 feet to 120 feet of mud being deposited each day. Sediment accumulation rates gone wild. We don't have any examples of processes that deposit this much mud in such a short amount of time. Full stop. Kindly remember that we just estimated the time's need for deposition alone and probably some consolidation. But without full drainage of the pore water, lithification, and all the other diagenetic changes cannot happen. Period. That in a nutshell is why young Earth fundamentalists have a mud problem and problems with geology in general. Going with the lower number, to form 100 feet 30 meters of Hermit Shale, we'd need to start with 200 feet 60 meters of Hermit mud. Using our fastest current day sediment accumulation rate of 5 centimeters per year, it could take 1,200 years to just deposit the muds that would one day be the thin end of the Hermit Shale. 11,000 years for the thicker end. Depositing the Hermit Shale alone does not fit with the young Earth creation interpretation of the Bible, which they insist must be true, so geology and physics and all the other sciences must be wrong so that their incorrect interpretation of the Bible can be correct. And remember, conventional geologists would use a mud deposition time of 365 days per year just for the Hermit mud. In the flood model, the Hermit mud is deposited in some unknown but much shorter time span than 365 days or 150 days. We've only just guessed that 15 days. 13 feet per day for 2 weeks and 120 feet for 2 weeks are physically impossible. Period. And there's more objection. In the flood model, don't forget the Hermit mud is not deposited until 3,000 or 4,000 feet of sediments have been deposited and then the Hermit on top. Want more complicated? It's even more worse for the young Earth fundamentalist. There is a lot of sedimentary rock in the Grand Canyon besides just the Hermit's couple few hundred feet. The sedimentary rocks exposed in the Grand Canyon alone are something like 5,000 feet, 1,500 meters, thick with the Hermit in the middle-ish. For those of you not so familiar with the Grand Canyon area, there's another 5,000 feet, 1,500 meters, of sedimentary rock in what we call the Grand Staircase on top of the rocks that form the Grand Canyon. That's 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters, almost 2 miles, of sedimentary rock just in the Grand Canyon and north into Utah. For simplicity's sake, a back-of-the-envelope calculation suggests that those 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters, would have formed from something like 20,000 feet, 6,000 meters of sediment. That original starting thickness will vary, of course, because there are limestones and sandstones mixed in with the mudstones, all with different starting porosities and diagenetic pathways. But you get the picture. And that's not all. The young Earth creationist problems continue. There are other time-consuming steps in making our Grand Canyon. We also need time for the mud to experience the joys of diagenesis and lithify. That will take temperature and pressure. Don't forget what we've already learned. Time and tectonic activity are needed to sink the Hermit mud into Earth's crust 2 or 3 miles, 1 or 2 kilometers, to reach the temperatures and pressures needed to lithify the mud into the shale that we would see in the Grand Canyon if we could afford the train fare. And the time to raise the Hermit Shale back up those couple of miles or kilometers to where we see it today takes time too. And the final installment of time? Colorado River still has to erode its way down through the Hermit and all the other formations above and below. It is the conventional geology position that Mother Earth just plain cannot accomplish all that work in the 4,400 years that the young Earth creationists allocate. It's just not geologically possible. Like I think we said a few minutes ago, the young Earth creationists have no full working model that explains how their thoughts and positions match up with any kind of reality. Young Earth cultists make wild claims that they are finding very complicated and difficult to prove. We will now refer to young Earth creationists' flood model as the failed flood model. And let us not forget that there are mudstone formations all over the world that are even thicker. We will note the kinds of sedimentation rates and final thicknesses we've seen are perfectly fine, reasonable, and acceptable to conventional geologists. Only Bible geologists can't handle the truth.
You can't handle the truth!
We are not pastors or church officials. We're dogs. Here's what we just do not understand. In the young Earth fundamentalist position, God Himself created this world. He Himself created the way this whole thing works. And yet it's His own most devoted disciples who are the ones refusing to understand and accept the magnificence of His creation. Young Earth creationistas ignore God's creation by relying on the Bible instead of their intelligence and their observations of nature. What makes us chuckle even more is that they don't even realize their own disobedience to their own God. That is some sin and some disconnect. That first example was the mudstone part of the mud problem. Let's try a second example that will demonstrate the mud part of the mud problem. The calcs will be easier, we promise. There is a silt and clay formation around the west side of the Gulf of Maine between Boston and Portland that's been named the Boston Blue Clay in Massachusetts and the Presumpscot Formation in Maine and New Hampshire. Same mud formation. Two names. Surficial geology map of eastern Massachusetts. Those blues along the coast are Boston Blue Clay. The purples are swamps underlain by the clay. The large brown areas in Boston are fills built onto the Boston Blue Clay. The blue clay continues offshore. And the Maine surficial geology map. Maine shows the same mud formation as purplish along the coast and up the river valleys. One other thing, see that blue line on the Maine surficial map? That's the inland marine limit. What's now land east and south of that blue line was open ocean at the time the Presumpscot mud was deposited. And just like with Massachusetts, the Presumpscot muds continue offshore. This is what the Boston Blue Clay looks like when fresh out of the ground. This sample was about 60 feet 18 meters down. These muds were deposited in areas that were formerly sea floor during the last ice age. By conventional geology, the clay was deposited 14 or 15,000 years ago around Boston and 11 to 15,000 years in Maine. By young Earth creation standards, the clay was deposited around 4,000 years ago after the flood and their one ice age. The clay is almost 150 feet, 46 meters in places, but is usually closer to 100 feet 30 meters thick. It is still mud right now and not mudstone. Let's do some recreational math and see what we can discover about mud deposition and diagenesis. Let's say the rates of Boston Blue Clay deposition were similar to current rates on continental shelves, close to the glacier sources of a few millimeters per year. For our example, let's say 6 millimeters, a quarter inch per year. That rate, the 100 feet 30 meters of Boston Blue Clay would be deposited in about 5,000 years. Seems slow to us. The blue clay would have been some number of miles downstream of the ice sheet's front, so the sediment supply would have been, shall we say, plentiful. Remember when we said in Chapter 1, close to sediment sources, lots of mud accumulation. Far from sediment sources, hardly any mud. How's about if we bump that up a bit to 25 millimeters per year? Using this faster sediment accumulation rate, that's an inch a year. 100 feet 30 meters of Boston Blue Clay would require 1,200 years to accumulate. That seems like a fast but not unreasonable rate from a conventional geology viewpoint. Using our SAR of the Seine of about 50 millimeters 2 inches per year, we'd need about 600 years to deposit the 100 feet 30 meters of Boston Blue Clay. That also makes sense to the conventional geology world. But not to the young Earth cultists. Looking at the times to deposit the Boston blue clay and the hermit mud together, we can see that using a range of present-day sediment accumulation rates, the numbers look good, even the fast 2 inches per year. Mud deposition rates of a couple of inches per year is fast but not crazy fast. The time frames needed to deposit the thick sequences of mud are long but not crazy long. Conventional geology would accept these types of rates. Maybe not these exact ones, but the same order of magnitude. What else can we learn from the Boston blue clay and pre-Sumskit formation? Clay is mostly normally consolidated. In geotechnical engineering terms, that normally consolidated means two important things. The clay formation has never been subjected to a loading pressure greater than its current loading. So, a cube of that clay at a depth of 50 feet, 15 meters, about halfway down, has never been loaded with more weight than the 50 feet, 15 meters of clay above our imaginary cube of clay. And normally consolidated means the Boston blue clay has not yet consolidated enough to drive out all the pore water, which would really start the lithification clock. So that means that in either 14,000 years, the conventional geology view, or 4,000 years, the young Earth view, the Boston blue clay has not yet expelled all of its pore water and therefore has not yet even begun to lithify. Comparing the Boston blue clay to other silt and clay deposits that have made it diagenetically all the way from mud to mudstone, we can boil it down to the basics here. The Boston blue clay is still mud, not even close to being mudstone. Mud can only begin to lithify once all its water has been expelled. The upper few feet of the clay is somewhat dried out and over-consolidated, but with water contents of 10 to 20%. Below this upper desiccated few feet, the Boston blue clay is still very soft and full of water. Water contents of 40 and 50% are common. You can see right there in narrator's hands that most of the water has not yet been expelled from the Boston blue clay even after 4,000 years in the young Earth view or 14,000 years in the conventional view. And we can see that lithification has not yet begun. It's right there. That means diagenetic processes have to take more than 4,000 years. And much longer than 14,000 years. That's what that means. In some far-off future, that 100 feet, 30 meters, of beautiful Boston blue clay might be compressed down and cemented into 50 feet, 15 meters of mudstone. Or shale. But for right now it's just plain old mud. And mud takes a while to dry out. All conventional geologists and engineers know that. Only Bible geologists deny this hard truth. Don't believe a pack of dogs? Will you believe the human experts at the U.S. Army's Corps of Engineers?
After the cell has been filled, drying begins. When material is placed in the cell, it's about 80% water. The wet material can take up to a year to dry and develop a crust capable of supporting construction equipment. At some point, dredged material begins to look cracked and barren, but there is still more water trapped in the material. Ditching creates a pathway to drain water trapped between layers of dredged material, which speeds drying.
Did you just catch that? It will take a year to dry out the clay enough to support heavy equipment. And those would be under ideal drying out in the sun conditions. Not underwater. Not with more mud being continuously deposited on top. Catch that, young Earth fundamentalist? Again, all conventional geologists and engineers know that mud needs time to dry out or have its water squeezed out. Only Bible geologists don't accept this simple, hard truth.
You can't handle the truth!
We just used two very simple examples to demonstrate that young Earth creationists are completely wrong. There is nothing salvageable in their positions. In our closing section to Chapter 2 of the Book of Diagenesis, we will pose a few questions that will challenge young Earth creationists to tell us how all this works in their world. We conventional geologists don't see how their hypotheses could even be possible. Their failed flood model does not work. Not a single part of it. We're going to close this section out now. The young Earth creationists' mud problem is manifold. In our humble opinion, the primary problems are mostly time-related. They don't include any time for making the silt and clay grains for the mud, or time to physically transport the mud from source to deposition, or time to actually deposit the mud. It's not an instantaneous thing, right? Or time for lithifying the mud into mudstone. They leave no time for diagenesis. And they have no sources capable of supplying the astronomical amounts of sediment they need. But these are all issues for another day. Since this is the Book of Diagenesis, we're confining ourselves to only the Diagenesis-related issues. Rest assured that we'll bring up the missing links at some point. Conventional geology explains all of this beautifully. The observations and calculations fit together hand in glove. We just don't understand what they don't understand. It's just geology in action. Nothing supernatural required. Young Earth fundamentalists need to explain how all these moving parts work together to give us what we see today for their flood model to succeed. But they won't even attempt it because they know they can't. The young Earth flood model is now the failed flood model. We predict that young Earthers will just whine, grumble about being persecuted by the meanie uniformitarian, evolutionary geologists, and declare God to be the geotechnical engineer of record who can make this all happen using his supernatural powers of physics. But that's not being truthful to God's creation, is it?
As we were researching this video, we learned of a paper by Scott Dunn in Creative Results Society Quarterly. Dunn's paper was behind a paywall for a very long time, and we just caught up with it last month. Dunn looks over young Earth creationist claims that sedimentary rocks can form quickly, in timeframes of months to years, in order to preserve their biblical storylines. Dunn correctly points out that very few quantifiable analyses have been performed and submitted for public consumption. We have seen exactly 0. This paper is actually pretty well written and enlightening. The author took a goodly amount of care in his preparations, calculations, and publication. It's nicely done. While we dogs call the claims of Bible geologists complete hogwash, Dunn much more politely concluded that the young Earth hypotheses are inconsistent with the well-known principles of engineering soil mechanics. We couldn't agree more. For example, in his Table 3, Dunn used reasonable-looking soil strength parameters to calculate that it could take 270,000 years for a 3,000-foot, 1,000-meter thick layer of silt and clay to achieve 90% consolidation. His calculations make sense overall. Extrapolating Mr. Dunn's example out just a bit further, assuming his initial porosity was 50% to keep things easy, that 270,000-year consolidation period could result in a consolidated bed of mud, 1,500 feet, 500 meters thick, after expelling all the pore water. That would be the mud's thickness as the mud begins to lithify into mudstone, so final thickness could vary. Dunn also took some of the wind out of our sails by briefly mentioning overpressuring of rapidly deposited sediments and the geotechnical stability of deep-sea muds. We alluded to these topics in Chapter 1 of the Book of Diagenesis and have plans to expand on this issue. Our primary conclusions seem to echo his, so allow us to paraphrase. There's not a snowball's chance in heck that the mud deposition and mudstone formation can have occurred in a biblical time frame. Not a chance. Bible geologists keep lying to themselves and to their flocks of gullibles. Wake up, people. Mr. Dunn's paper is cited in the description below. It's well worth reading. The mud problem will be one of our favorite topics for future discussion. It is not a winning subject for the young Earth fundamentalist.
Young Earth advocates have been shouting, "The flood did it," and claiming victory for a very long time. For young Earth creationists to be taken seriously, they need to back up their claims with their observations, maps, and calculations. Because young Earth creationist thoughts and hypotheses run counter to conventional geology viewpoints, it is incumbent upon them to provide compelling evidence to us. Step up to the plate and engage with us in an honest and open manner. That's your only way forward. To date, young Earth fundamentalists have provided almost nothing believable or worthy of further consideration. Because of the nutty claims with no evidence, conventional geologists see Bible geologists' claims as wildly speculative, unrealistic, wholly unsupported, and ridiculous. It is so bad now that we conventional geologists look at Bible geologists and see them only as fringe crackpots that spew only nonsense. That's more than just a few minor disagreements. Their versions of geological events are physical and mathematical impossibilities. Even this pack of dogs can see that the young Earth community has nothing to offer. We suspect that most Bible geologists know deep down that they are wrong. We had very similar education and book-learned all the same material. That means they are lying to themselves and to their followers. Hey, does that not break commandment number 9? That's the prohibition on lying for those keeping track. Naughty, naughty. It gets worse. Their message is usually delivered with a strident, arrogant tone that only inflames the situation and raises tensions with the conventional geology community. Their condescension reaches biblical proportions. You know, we've been discussing the demeaning behavior that Bible geologists show their conventional geology brothers and sisters. In Sunday school, we always learned that pride was a sin that hinders a true relationship with God. But we learned that a long time ago. Perhaps things have changed. Or maybe that just applies to Catholics. Does Jesus not say in James 4:6 that God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble? God clearly encourages humility and rejects pride. And yet all we see is insulting and demeaning behavior wrapped up in vanity from God's chief geology officers. What's up with that? We do not claim to be Bible scholars. We're dogs. The vast majority, and it isn't even close, of geologists are conventional geologists. We could count the number of Bible geologists on the fingers of our right hands if we had hands. Or fingers. Bible geologists have to depict themselves to their fundamentalist followers as being on the cutting edge of geology research, which means they have to portray conventional geologists as bumbling misfits. Belittling us is the key to their financial success. But remember, gentle viewer, all their money and influence does not change the one essential truth, is science that advances whilst religion reverses. And this very tiny group of Bible geologists and their followers scornfully refer to conventional geologists as uniformitarian or evolutionary geologists. They need to make up words just to belittle and debase those who disagree and follow a different path. Want some more truth? Into the 1800s, virtually all geologists were Bible geologists who investigated Mother Earth to learn more about the glory of God's creation. The evidence they observed and the inferences they drew became the basis for modern conventional geology. The Bible geologists of the 20th and 21st centuries only dress up the same arguments and interpretations that the 19th century Bible geologists dismissed from lack of evidence. The original Bible geologists of the 19th century threw out the exact same arguments and interpretations over 100 years ago. Conventional geologists have moved on from their Bible-bearing brethren using our powers of observation, critical thinking, and technology. Bible geologists cling to their Bibles for science misguidance. And here at Geoapologetics Ministry, we wear that moniker with honor. We are evolutionary geologists. What young Earth creationary thoughts and theories do we want to know more about today? Number 3. Remember, just Diagenesis chapter 2 today.
The big board says 1. The Bright Angel Shale can be 400 feet 120 meters thick in the Grand Canyon. Assuming the Bright Angel's precursor mud was holy clay and had an initial porosity of 50%, determine how long it took for 800 feet 240 meters of mud to consolidate to the point where we all can agree that the Bright Angel mud had reached 100% consolidation and lithification into the Bright Angel Shale could then have begun. Use the typical permeability and consolidation parameters for the clay of your choosing. 2. Using the principles of soil and rock mechanics as needed, demonstrate the plausibility that the muds that form the Hermit Formation in Grand Canyon were stacked up and stable as unlithified sediments just before initiation of the erosion that began the Grand Canyon. Was the Grand Canyon formed by the Colorado River eroding through the Hermit mud or eroding through the Hermit mudstone? 3. The Niobrara Oil Shale is 900 to 1,800 feet 275 to 550 meters thick. Tell us how Earth provided the vertical accommodating space needed to accumulate the mud as quickly as the young Earth creationist flood model requires? For mudstone can be read. Conventional geologists infer continental origins in shallow floodplains and swamps. Present a model of sediment deposition over time that demonstrates how red beds like the Grand Canyon's Hermit Formation can be found interbedded within marine deposits. To make it easier for you, just focus on the formations below the Coconino sandstone. Ignore the Coconino for now. 5. How does the young Earth fundamentalist model of flood mud deposition explain the Boston blue clays not reaching full consolidation within 4,000 years and full lithification in 4,000 years? 6. The uppermost several feet of a marine clay deposit is commonly a desiccated crust that forms through exposure to air, through a drop in sea level, for example. Desiccation dries the clay quite a bit, but not completely. Does this scenario conform to the young Earthers' failed flood model?
As a geology book, the Book of Diagenesis triumphs over the Book of Genesis every time. That's because the Bible was never intended to be a science book. It doesn't take a pack of dogs to see that. If only Bible geologists were more interested in learning Earth's truths and less interested in being sinful, perhaps they would see the compelling evidence right in front of them. Then they could begin re-educating their young Earth followers into the 21st century. We have witnessed young Earth creationists lying, misrepresenting, misinforming, and ignoring evidence that they can see with their own eyes just so they can claim their Bibles are correct. Their wickedness knows no bounds. A note of caution to our conventional geologist viewers: at least at introductory levels of education and in pop science articles, we geologists probably do mix facts with our inferences, stating as fact what are actually our educated guesses. At higher levels of education, we usually do see inferences identified as educated guesses with a touch less certainty. But young Earth fundamentalists don't usually get that far in a geology education to see that shift. The fundamentalists constantly beat their drums of combat, belittling our knowledge, expertise, and accomplishments, while simultaneously embellishing their own. Doubt and confusion based on ignorance, all delivered in a combative setting, are their hallmarks. Bible geology is nothing more than fiction. That is our claim. Prove us wrong. That concludes today's sermon. Thank you very much for watching this video. We are a new channel, so you really should subscribe. We dogs need all the help we can get. Tap on the thumbnail for our other videos. We look forward to you seeing us over there.